Well, thank you for coming on a night when you could be updating your status. You could be doing something that does not create community, and instead you're coming together to make this little seed. I think it's really important now more than ever to have these moments where we talk to one another. And I am so honored to have these new people. First of all, Sunil's book is Your Heart is a Muscle the Size of a Fist. An incredible novel told from seven perspectives about the WPA Seattle riots. And then we'll talk about point of view being political later. And Dana Johnson, who I felt very lucky to meet this last summer, is a Squaw Valley community writer. So I'm just hoping we have some conversation, and we'll have a little Q&A after. Have your questions fermenting, because that will be the most exciting part of the evening. But we'll begin by talking about these issues. So we'll all talk. How about let's just each read a little. You all have a paragraph you could read?
Sure.
Okay, so we'll just read a little paragraph from our work that might exemplify something about how we think about class, race, societal issues in this moment through the prism of fiction. So, Dana, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm just going to read a quick section from a story because that's just easier in my collection in the Not Quite Dark. And the setup is that there's a little girl who lives downtown in Los Angeles, and she's afraid to leave her building because of the homeless population. The neighborhood's quickly gentrifying, but this little girl is having trouble adapting, so I'm just going to read. There's a man lying in the street as they're getting their ice cream. As they got closer to the man, Dakota took Frida's hand, Dakota's the daughter and Frida's her mom, and squeezed it. There was a lot of power in that little hand. Her other hand held her ice cream cone, which she was concentrating on fiercely. The ice cream was organic, which Dakota had complained tasted funny at first, although Frida wondered how could she possibly tell. But the more Dakota ate it throughout the months, the more she got used to it. They got closer to the man, lying right in the middle of the sidewalk, arms and legs spread as if he had been making snow angels on the hot concrete. When they passed him, Frida looked at her daughter and saw her big gray eyes get small and determined. She licked her ice cream cone. "Is he dead, Mama?" "No, he's not dead," Frida said, though she didn't know if this was true or not. She told herself that if the man were dead, people wouldn't be walking around him. "Are you sure he's not dead?" Dakota looked back again. "If he's dead, then there's nothing we can do," Jackson, her father, said. He took a napkin and wiped some of the ice cream running down Dakota's hand. "And if he were dead, he wouldn't just be lying in the middle of the sidewalk, so he's probably not. Look, we're almost home." "But if he's not dead," Dakota said, turning her head again, turning her whole body, "can we do something, Papa? If he's not dead, then we should help him." Jackson stopped. He knelt in front of his daughter. "If he's not dead," Jackson said, "then it's harder." "Why? Can't we take him to someplace?" "That's hard. Maybe there's something wrong with his brain and maybe he needs help and we can't help him." Dakota looked at Frida. "Can we take him to where you get the help?" "Well," Frida knelt down, "you can't do that for everybody, baby."
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't want to jump right into it, but it made me think of so many things. One of which is what we call political novels. When we talk about what that means, but it's so often the collision of two worlds like that. I mean, the collision of class. I'm so interested in that, and it also made me think. It's very interesting how we have to be trained to not see things, right? And one of the themes that's been occurring to me over the last 40 years. It was particularly the last, I'd say, 3 weeks, thinking about this, and also having seen "I'm Not Your Negro," the James Baldwin film. This idea of happiness depending on pretending in some sense, and so pretending, how in some ways we create this illusion by pretending not to see that man, even though we all see him, and it's the child that calls attention to it. I don't know, it's very interesting.
Now you'll choose a paragraph that links exactly.
Probably not. So there's 7 characters, as Edie mentioned. It takes place over the course of one day. They tell a story from the vantage point of 2 protesters who are militantly nonviolent, if you can get with that phrase. 2 cops who are in the street, rank and file cops who are trying to make sense of it all and also control the crowd in what they think is a nonviolent way, although it gets very violent. There's a chief of police. There is the delegate who's from Sri Lanka, where my dad is from, who's there for the meetings. And then there's the main character, who's the chief of police's son, and he is not political in any way. He's trying to sell weed to the protesters. And so I see some of my students here. So a tip for aspiring novelists is create an interesting character, give them a terrible idea that's never going to work, and then let them go. So this is that guy. And so he's not political, and he offered me as a writer a way to look at the protests from a 3rd or even 4th vantage point, a sort of naive man. So he's a bit naive about it. He didn't know whether to stand or sit, to go streaking through the city with his hands on his head, or to collapse in the street in open-mouthed wonder. Because here they came, the defenders of democracy, riding the ferry in from the islands, climbing down from the haze of an interstate bus, crossing the bridge in their Subarus, their aging Toyotas, their cheap American rolling junk, and Victor, bestowed with the unenviable gift of geography and sight, looked at their t-shirts and flannels and fleeces, their backpacks and jeans, and he thought of the factories along the border in Mexico, the lines of women waiting for work to begin, the razor wire fences behind which the things of the world were made, the smoke curling into the sky like a pencil drawing of a drowned woman's hair. And he thought, how do you protest this?
Beautiful. Yeah, so you can hear these, again, it's this idea of the seam or the rupture, the collision of these different worlds. I'm going to read something kind of not dissimilar in a way. So I taught for some years recently at art college, and my daughter became a good friend with an older girl who was the daughter of the janitor. And trying to talk about how it was just a complex relationship for everyone in a way. From the street, this is a story called Koi. A small girl stretches her hand over the splintering rail, throwing food pellets into the water in a peacock tail burst. Her older friend, daughter of the college's custodian, knows to save her. You can see her thinking, save up, throw 1 pellet at a time, wait before throwing the next. To fish, only the eternity of appetite matters. Below the rickety platform, a ravenous will to power provides strategies to match. You leap over others' backs to get to any pellet still floating above the melee. Small fish circle up the iris, sharp gold zigzags, while a larger fish stabs in, its mouth and O so stretched, a smaller one accidentally enters. That's how Jonah got swallowed, the small one asks, but the older one, Shania, just shakes her head. So, I thought maybe we could just start by talking, maybe we could talk about, there's so many questions we could talk about, but one thing we could talk about is who is our imagined reader as we begin to write, and what is our hope for our fiction? Take it away any way you want to do. Oh, first, before you do that, how many people here are aspiring writers? Wait, raise your hand in this group. Okay, good. You gotta wave those hands more. I know a very interesting waveforms in the crowd. Okay, go ahead. Anyway, so yes.
I had a couple imagined readers. One was, so the riots that I was writing about actually occurred. They occurred in Seattle in November '99. And so to write about a recent historical event that was a very charged historical event was fraught with danger. Like one of my imaginary readers was a really pissed off guy in Seattle who was going to come to my reading and say, "You got it wrong." So there was that fear always over my shoulder, and I had to try not to listen to that too much, you know. So it was this, for me, it was a very constant balancing act between deep research, feeling obligated to be accurate in my telling of the story, and particularly in the timeline of the story. For instance, tear gas went off before any windows were broken. That's an important point, and it's important to get that right. And then my obligation as a storyteller, and there's where my audience might be me, you know, in some ways as a reader, like what I want to read, and I like to read stories that are emotionally true. So it's the obligation to the actual accuracy of what happened, the factual truth, and then the accuracy or the obligation as a storyteller to the emotional truth of what happened. And so what I did was I used factual events and I used fictional characters. That was my strategy. And so the readers were an angry Seattle guy, and then me.
So, but is your hope to stitch together kind of imagined community of readers?
Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, I mean, in some level, I mean, it's my first book, right? So in some level, I think as writers we're conditioned to expect to be ignored. So I was in fact completely expecting to be ignored. I started this book, which seems relevant today, in 2009, before there were any sort of mainstream protests happening. You know, I thought and here's where we get to fiction that matters. To me, it mattered because it mattered to me. It was something I felt drawn to write about, and so that's what I chose. I didn't rip it from the headlines. I mean, God forbid, if I started a novel today, that it would still be relevant 6 years from now, right? When I finish it, I hope to God it would not be. You know what I mean? I hope we live in a different time and place in 6 years than we do now. But once it was out in the world, or once I recognized that it might be actually published and out in the world, I don't know if I intentionally wanted to create a community, but that writing it to me is magical. It's an ancient technology of mind reading, telepathy, whereby through black marks on white paper, I mean, a dead person or me can communicate in the most intimate manner with a reader. And there's this mind symbiosis, this mind melt that happens. And that's the community I wanted to create, really, is a community of writer and reader. And to connect with one person is enough. And the fact that it connected with more is, you know, just gravy, right? But that is also, I can't ever imagine setting out to write a book like that. That created that community, but it did happen by deeply connecting with, you know, one reader.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
It's nice. Yeah, no, actually, when Sunil's talking, I'm thinking of that thing that Don DeLillo said at some point, that when he said, terrorists are hijacking the central narrative of our lives, and there's greater freedom to be found working the margins of a dying art. So the great freedom of writing from the margins. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you? How does that work for you?
It's going to sound like bullshit, but I actually don't think of an audience when I'm writing. And that is simply because I see myself as just a writer telling stories. And I really resist a kind of categorization where I'm an African-American woman writer, so I should be writing toward those people. And I think about, it's funny, the very first time, it was my first gig as a teacher, I was a professor at Indiana University, and I taught a course called American Literature, and this American Literature course had all manner of Americans, ethnic Americans, there were all kinds of folks. It wasn't a white syllabus, and I remember the student raised his hand on the first day, this guy, he said, I thought this was an American literature course. Yeah. To this day, I just get hyperventilate when I think of him saying that. And I feel like that is the problem with American literature, right? And so I'm writing toward and to all Americans, because all Americans need to read each other's work, period. End of discussion. So I try not to think about that. And I feel like writers need to, or readers rather, if they feel like this book isn't my book, this is about a queer man in New York or whatever, and I'm a white Southern woman in Alabama, that book's not my book, you should absolutely, like, that's the first book you should be reading, right? That's just how I think about it, so. No audience for me, just people who like to read and wanna hopefully learn something. Not that I'm like, so like, I'm gonna teach somebody something, but that's when I read a book that is just so like, I haven't thought about this before, or I don't know this world, I'm fascinated.
I mean, that's what's one of the unique powers and joys and pleasures of reading, right?
Yeah.
Is that you get to experience it's one thing that you can't do in a movie, although I love movies, and I love, right? You don't get to enter into the interior of people. And in books, we get inside the skin, literally, of different folks. And my God, what another incredible, magical thing, right? And that's one of my favorite things about writing.
And I'm just, this is just like a follow-up, because it's so interesting that in your book, you inhabit lots of different folks as a writer. And I'm just wondering, as a writer, what were you thinking as you would say, okay, I'm going to write this person, I'm going to write this person? Did you feel permission to do that?
Yeah, that's a fraught question. You could do
That
a
was
whole
exactly, that was where I wanted to go next too.
Okay,
Because thing of the question, I just saw Anna DeVere Smith talking about how important it is for us, especially right now, to reach, across the chasm of otherness and, have the empathy, the magical empathy. What do you think about representation of otherness?
Well, I would, Marlon James and I, it should be a name drop more. Marlon James and I had a conversation once, and he's a good friend, so it was all with love. But I said I think empathy is a radical act, and that empathy, particularly as a writer, trying to empathize with others, but do the work of empathy. By the way, that doesn't mean that I'm going to write a Guatemalan female cop. Oh, I just start writing. You do the work, right? And there are skills associated with empathy, like deep listening, which translates to deep research. It's just as hard as me. If I'm going to write a cop, I need to do my work. And if I'm going to write all of that. Marlon said, I think empathy is a fucked up colonial invention. And he was kind of tongue-in-cheek and also serious. I mean, there is that danger where writing the other is, we can fall into stereotypes, we can fall into exoticizing people, we can fall into what I think is a really dangerous trap, which is where we tell other people's stories when they are perfectly capable of telling them themselves. And particularly for me as a straight, cisgendered man, I'm a person of color, but I have a certain privilege and my voice, it sort of is just naturally louder. And so there's the danger of overwhelming other people's voices. In this case, I didn't think that protesters and hardcore activists had been waiting 16 years to find out how they felt about their own story. So I didn't feel that I was appropriating their story. Although that's what I was terrified of that guy telling me, right? That imaginary reader. And so I was always aware of that. It's a hard line. Do we have permission? I think artistically, yes. We have to feel as writers we have permission to write anything. But you better be ready for the criticism. You better be open to people telling you got it wrong, or you overstepped your bounds, or maybe fell into pitfalls. I mean, you should be open to that. I mean, even writing yourself, honestly, the reason I wrote 7 characters like this is because writing myself is more difficult. How well do I know myself? Like my motivations? Am I so sure about my motivations? Even that is a form of fiction.
Where do you stand on that, Dina? What's your sense?
Well, I agree with Sunil. I think writers should be able to write what they want to write, but with that comes the burden of doing the homework and the research, because certain people don't necessarily get to write the book or get the big book deal and get the exposure. And so if you're going to be that person writing about people who are outside of your own experience, you have to be mindful of the privilege of that and the burden to get that right, and but at the same time, not feeling as though you can't. We go around and around with this in my graduate fiction workshop at USC because my students are very adamant that if that's not your experience, you should not be teaching these things. And I feel like old-fashioned or something, because I feel like, but you should be able to. But on the other hand, I understand why the tendency is to resist that, because so many people have gotten it wrong.
Yes.
So many people have decided to sit down as a white man and write black female characters, for example, and just screw it up so badly. And yet that book's out in the world and people are like, you know, you should read this book, it's amazing.
I think, you know, that's
And it's
not a
wrong.
minor point, that's a huge, huge point, right? Because that creates a cultural understanding of, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, I think we have to really interrogate where our cultural understanding of people different than ourselves comes from.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Who wrote that? So
Yeah.
whose view is that?
Yeah.
But
If
so
you don't
is-
have the direct experience yourself, right?
So is there less permission to write down than there is to write up on the socioeconomic scale?
Roach folks are hard to write about too.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know.
as we were just discussing.
Yeah, that's an alien world.
Yes. Well, you know, I guess here's another question. So, you know, there was this period in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation period, where, you know, it was sort of like, okay, white people, you have really held the scene. Can you just be quiet, Nadine Gordimer? Can you not let us have a chance here? Do you feel like that's our moment right now, culturally? Are we in a sort of moment where it would be, you know, I'm just curious about that kind of the speaking and the silencing and what you see right now in the culture?
That's a tough question.
It is a tough question.
But I mean, the cool thing is, you know, like Viet Nguyen won the Pulitzer for The Sympathizer, and Tyon the Just won the Pulitzer for
Yeah.
Polio, and like Robin Cost Lewis won the National Book Award. Like, there are all these folks of color who are writing work that I think is finally getting out there more. So that is really exciting. But I don't know, again, the writer in me is just like, well, I'm thrilled by that, but maybe there's someone out there who's got an amazing story to tell, who's not a person of color, but who might nevertheless get that right and tell it the way it needs to be told. So,
Right after the election, I was having this fantasy of carpet bombing rural America with, you know, books of difference by people, you know, like Walmart lines and rural, you know, but really like having the Center for Fiction, for example, fund this effort, you know, written by all of you. Anyway, but I mean, this is a very privileged, elite little group here. We are in New York City, you are reading, you came out on a night to talk about difference, you know, how does fiction matter? How can fiction matter now? How do we assume that old campfire role? We are storytellers around the fire. My story may change some paradigm or tell some very important cultural myth that needs to be brought to light.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One is our role as storytellers, and I think stories are more important than ever. Stories, of course, are an ancient human technology, or as like fundamental as sex and eating. Like, what else feels good? You know what I mean? Like, where are you when you're reading a story? You're not in the chair, and you're not in the story, which is actually really dangerous. Like, biologically, stories do a weird thing to your brain where you're not aware of your surroundings, which, going back to the days of lions eating us, is like a really dangerous thing. So there must be a really important thing happening, right, with storytelling. I think back in the day, it was back in the day, whatever. A while ago. You know, it was the way that we, probably before writing, it was the way that we encoded information and passed that on, right? So, but that's still biologically encoded in it. So storytelling is very, very powerful on a biological and neurological, chemical level. They can touch us. So as storytellers, we're working in a very powerful form. And whatever the political climate, particularly in a, what do they call it? Alternative fact? you know, post-truth, blah, 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 whatever that is.
I know.
I don't know, whatever. But
It's amazing.
yeah, I think storytelling becomes incredibly important in that moment. It's always important. But then there's this other role of where I'm going to be a little bit cynical, where I think, and I'll come back to being hopeful, but where as storytellers we're also just writers working in the culture. And I think it's, for me, important, I guess with my first book it was important, or realization to become aware of, you know, a good book sells maybe 30,000 copies. There's very few books that sell 100,000. So 30,000 copies, and like how many people watched the season finale of whatever HBO's last show was, like 1.8 million? You know, like, that's not to, I don't want to say that books aren't important, but I do think it's important to recognize that it's a fairly small group of people that read fiction. And I don't know, I guess I'm just aware of that. In terms of, does fiction matter? I'm aware that, you know, not everybody reads fiction, you know? My brother loves to talk about how technology is changing the world, and I'm like, dude, how many people in the world don't have electricity? Like, let's be open to that reality and aware of that. Like, I hope my book changes lives. I'm aware that it's not gonna go all over the world, you know?
Yeah.
On the other hand, how many people do I need to have read me? Someone sent me a letter from Standing Rock, and I was at Standing Rock, but someone sent me a letter after I was there and said, she was a grandmother in her 80s, and said, I've been thinking recently, this was a while ago, but she said, I've been thinking, why do I get up in the morning to face this battle we know we're going to lose? She said, I read your book, and it made me understand and feel again why we're out there. Just that one letter is enough for me.
Right.
That's fiction matters. Fuck, I don't care how many people buy the book. That one it mattered to her. You know,
That's
that's
beautiful.
enough.
Yeah. What about you? What do you feel about anything?
Yeah, I mean, yes, of course, fiction matters, and for the reasons that Sunil says, it's not necessarily about how many people read the book, but I guess the idea of like what's being discussed and what's being put out in the world, and what might be new information or revelatory or affirming, confirm. I don't know, I think that's why any of us tell a story. My first novel was this really weird coming of age story about a kind of Black nerd in the suburbs of LA, not unlike myself, growing up. And the cool thing is, again, I wasn't thinking of audience, I just was like, growing up, I never read a book where there was a Black girl who was just sort of like running around like with, and I was born in '67, so my time was like Tiger Beat magazine and Leaf Garrett and like all these weird references, and I was like this weird cultural outlier, just like a weirdo. And there was never a book like that I got to read when I was a kid that's like, you're weird, and there are lots of other people who are weird like you who don't fit into this idea of what Blackness is, or what Black identity is. And so it was a kind of similar story where I ran into someone and they were like, I never read a weird book with this like wacky Black girl in it, that's just weird. And part of it's like discussing assimilation and how Black people assimilate, and what is a suburban Black person versus someone from the city, and all of this stuff I was trying to get at. And I hadn't read a book like that, so I was gonna write that book. Yeah. That's just what I was gonna do.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of two things. There's the thing August Wilson says, every man should wake up and see the face of his God in the mirror. So it's sort of, as fiction becomes that God. And then there's also something Toni Morrison said, that I write village fiction that I want to read. And so we're filling that void somehow. We're trying to write something so we can recognize and make sense of our own solipsistic experience and make it a gift in a commodity culture somehow.
Yeah.
What about you? But one of your questions was...
I know, what was one of my questions?
Yeah, I was thinking something you said about that writing, maybe we already talked about this a little bit, but sort of writing, that writing politically includes sort of reaching out toward, or other people or trying to have conversations with other people that you wouldn't necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I said that, but I'm happy to take.
Yeah, it was something like, I'm paraphrasing.
But let's talk about this. What about the choice, and some of you are writers here, the choice of perspective as a political act? Let's talk about that. And also let's talk about misnomers your work has gotten. You know, I know you chafe at hearing that you've written a protest novel.
Yeah, I mean, they even put an anarchy A for anarchy novel.
Which is a very funny organizing principle. Yeah, you're branded as somebody for, you know.
I want to hear what you have to say about multiple narrators or multiple points of view, but I only read that because of the binary, and it's what you were talking about. So if you're an African American writer, then you're somehow not an American writer, or if I'm a political writer, then I'm not a literary writer. What is, you know, like, so my friend Amitabh Kumar goes into bookstores and says, "Can I see your white literature section, please?" You know, just to like kind of bring it to
Play with their heads.
Why is one literary and one is ethnic literary? Like, it's just American fiction. It's just fiction. This is literary fiction. I hope, you know. I mean, I think there is something called political fiction, and I'm jumping your thing. Let's talk about something.
No, it's okay. No, but all fiction is political.
Well, all fiction is political. I think there is something called political fiction. With Baldwin talks about this just another protest novel, where he hammers Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, saying that that's a terrible book and that that's political fiction. And what he identifies, some of the characteristics he identifies are that it's sentimental in terms of a sort of a false feeling, a dishonest feeling, and the idea of manipulation. And the idea also that the book has already answered a question and is trying to bring you to the side of that answer. Slavery is wrong. We could compare that to what was Edward P. Jones's last book?
Well, the collection?
No, just the novel.
The
Known World.
Yeah.
The Known World, where the premise isn't slavery is wrong. The premise is slaves are humans, right? Which is a whole nother. To me, that's a simplification, but that's a whole other way to approach a similar subject. You know, you're gonna get to the realization that slavery is one of the deepest evils that ever occurred, but you start with the premise that, African Americans are full humans, right? You know what I mean? Instead of starting with the premise that slavery is wrong, and this what Baldwin calls a pamphlet.
That's right.
That's political
When the
fiction. It's what
characters are
feels like a
freaking out.
pamphlet.
But you know what's interesting? Because there was a time where Baldwin was sort of marginalized for being too political. And now he's like, everybody loves Baldwin, everybody. Sort of like when MLK was, protesting Vietnam and stuff. Like, now everybody looks back. They're like, oh, he was back in the day. We're like, who is this? Like, no. But now it's like, oh, we're all kumbaya-ing MLK. And Baldwin was similar, where I remember people like, well, he's not that good because his stuff is like too political. And now scholars, everyone's studying him, everybody loves him. But he was at the time taking up the mantle of this stuff that needs to be discussed. And even to this day, if you read a Baldwin novel, like Another World or anything, nobody's writing like he writes. Like, everything's so sanitized and commercialized and ready for HBO or whatever. It's gross. It's so gross what's happened to literature. You read, my students were getting the vapors when I taught Giovanni's room. They were just you can write, what is? They were freaking out. And now everything's just very nice, even, So, but I want that. I want that for literature.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling about what would be good political fiction, but this is good fiction. I never remember who says this stuff, but this is a quote, good fiction disturbs comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable. And so that's that disruption of the paradigm or of the norm. What's the norm? I think that's inherently political in a good way, right? forget what we're actually going to talk about.
We're-
Narrators or points of view.
We're talking about points of view, but I think we could go on talking, but I feel the questions in this group, and I sort of would like to open it up, then we may go back to our little colloquy here. Do you have any questions for our esteemed panelists? Good.
I have a question. The homeless man on the street, you had talked about people writing outside of their culture. How many homeless people have written books? I mean, people who have come, they're not the only homeless person, but they come from a family of really destitute people. Are there a lot of homeless people who have written their books? And the second thing is, homeless people, they're from over the country, all over the world. They have different life experiences. How do you just write one homeless person and say, this is a typical homeless person? I don't think you can.
That's a,
Well, yeah, you shouldn't. No. No, I mean, that's just like anything. It's like if you're writing any character, that's not the character that represents all of whatever that is. That's impossible, you know? And in this story, I was not writing through it's not first person narrator on how to be, you know, what homelessness is, although somebody could attempt that. I wasn't going to do that, but I was going to write about how it is that we learn not to look. That's what I was going to write about, how we normalize just sort of stepping over someone in America. What is that? So that's different than writing through the point of view.
but your question's a good one. Your question, behind your question is this human tendency I think we have to see things as allegories and say, okay, here's this very particular thing, and behind it, this represents the whole cosmos of homeless people. So the job of the fiction writer is how particularized can it be so that we're seeing anew with new eyes, and we're feeling the humanity, as Dana's saying.
Well, like with him, I'm a fourth generation New Yorker. Suppose I decide to write about a cattle rancher in Montana and I do all the research, I'm still not going to get it right, am I?
Why not?
But you know, there's some part of your psyche that might be a tuning for there's some reason that you're wanting to write about that. So, you know, the tack might be to just really immerse yourself in that world and do the work so that the empathy is not just going with your first prefab stereotypical cliches that are out
But
there.
here's the answer to that. So what makes a cattle rancher in Montana an interesting fictional character? Is it the details of his life, like that you get the shoes that he wears right, which you could get through research? Or is it feeling lonely out on the ranch? You know what I mean? The sort of interior emotional stuff. And you, being a fourth generation New Yorker, still probably experience loneliness in this big city, right? Like, you know what I mean? There's emotional connections you can draw between people that are different than you. I mean, that's how I did it, right? Is that this book is people different than me, but filled with my own emotional experience.
And then it matters because you're working it out on the page. You know, it's like that thing Gordon Lish says, you know, write your wound. And these are your little sock puppets for your wound. For some reason, it's that cattle rancher.
And we mentioned Ed Jones earlier, one of them, like, he's written 2 collections in the Known World, and the Known World is one of the things that makes it so amazing. Again, he writes about all kinds of people in the institution of slavery, right? So not only was Ed Jones not around then, neither was he a white slave owner or a black slave owner, who's the person who sort of, the whole story hinges on this black slave owner's death. You know, it's like an omniscient point of view that goes into like white women's heads, white slave, I mean, he's everywhere in that book. And it's devastating. And it's not because he's the voice of white slave owners everywhere, right? That's just not what he's trying to do, but he's trying to talk about what does it mean for a human to own another human, and what is the cost of that, period. And then out of all of that are these beautiful characters in this incredible world that he creates.
And then your task is create
Humans, right?
Yeah. I had an experience with my second novel where, you know, all my family was killed in the Holocaust, my dad's family. And I wanted to understand the mind of evil that could perpetrate evil. And so I wrote in the voice of a French Vichy official reckoning with memory and kind of the commodification of wartime memory. Just to really access the evil part of my psyche was incredibly cathartic. I highly recommend it. but to because we look at these people, I'm going to assume the political sensitivities here, but we look at Trump or we look at George W. Bush, we look at these people, we think, what are they thinking in the inner sanctum of their mind? And fiction is such a nice technology for trying to, just to have the empathy for the evildoers as well. It's amazing. And I mean, maybe it's useful for the reader, but it was helpful for this writer. Yeah. What else? You have a question.
I have a ton of things. No, I just wanted to say that I'm an immigrant here, and I see this amazing moment where many different perspectives are being shared, and it's very touching to see that, because I'm Spanish and I've been living in Latin America, where cultures are way more solid and monolithic, and having the capacity to have a dialogue there is impossible. So I understand why many people are frustrated now here, but at the same time I'm amazed and thrilled to see and be here in this moment.
Makes sense to say. What else? Go ahead, Holly.
So my question is just, as educators, how have you ever had a situation where you've been reading somebody's student's work and they've been trying to portray the other, and in your mind they just failed miserably and it's a stereotype? And because I've taken workshops where that's happened, and sometimes I felt that the teacher hasn't sort of brought that up, and so if you have any sort of, what's the best way to handle that that's constructive for everybody?
It's a painful moment. I have too many examples of that to speak of. I mean, I could just speak all night about that. But
Please do. I'm not the most diplomatic, so please, offer something more constructive.
Okay, so one time I was teaching a class in which the son of a very famous rock star was speaking with somebody who had grown up in New Orleans after Katrina and he had gained literacy at 14 because the schools were so broken. And then he went on to be, this Teach for America star, met Michelle Obama, it was like, this amazing success story, writing in the dialect of Katrina and this entitled boy and these other entitled K through 12 Manhattan private school kids in the same class. And then every now and then some of them would just portray the single black character would be, the criminal, or would be, and it's a very strange thing, this pseudo United Nations of a workshop where you're supposed to come up with a lingua franca where you all understand one another. And it's sort of the hoop of the Tower of Babel, like, can we all just get along? Can we all just have some language? And I think the goal, it goes back to something Sunil was saying, it's how does one have really deep listening enough to have both sides listening? This offends me because you are only portraying an angry black woman, or, is there a way that you could particularize it? Can you find your own humanity as a writer in it, or, or whatever it is? But yes, I could go on all night. What do you want to say?
Yeah, it's tough. It's really tough. And so often, I'm teaching, especially the young writers that undergraduate writers, they'll often have, they'll have like a story where its default whiteness is just like Bob living his life, and then in wanders the black guy, and he's speaking in a very particular vernacular, and then so all of a sudden I have to start breaking down like, well, why aren't these other people delineated in the way that this person is delineated? And let's talk about why you did that, and let's talk about how sort of the equality of humanity needs to be represented on the page, not just like spice that wandered in, like ethnic spice that wandered in and then wanders back out. And then we're back to just like the normal whiteness in the story. You know, there's a lot of that. But I say that that's because, well, there's two things. Oftentimes students aren't well read enough, but then oftentimes even in contemporary fiction where people are sort of known to be good writers or whatever, there's just this world and it's just Joan and Frankie and Sue, and I guess they're white. And then there's like some ethnic person wanders in. Like, and so we just have to be
And we
better.
get full graphic detail to call it their hair,
Yeah,
their eyes, and all the signal, that's things that signal the race.
Yeah,
It's like a
so I
code
just
switch
try to
kind
get
of
them
thing.
to think about like, oh, you just made that choice, why did you make that choice? Let's unpack that and let's see how we can sort of write everybody in a way that's more human than just kind of types and default whiteness.
What else? Please.
To answer your question, I used to wonder if you could write cross-culturally and get it right. Like you said, you said that you do the work. One of the best books I ever write, I like to read a lot of historical fiction. And back in 2013, I read a debut novel called The House Girl. And if I didn't look at the back flap, I would never believe it was written by a Caucasian woman. Because it was written so well, she captured it, she did it in a respectful way, but it was so authentic. I mean, everything she got right, and every so often I kept flipping back to the flap, looking, and then going back to reading because it was one of the best books I ever read.
That's fantastic.
Tara Conklin.
The House Girl.
It
Wasn't
was
there a
about the
good?
antebellum South, about a slave girl who was the house girl, and she was an artist. So, back then you weren't allowed to have any of those pursuits or whatever. But her mistress liked her so much that she let her draw in her studio. So she couldn't sign anything because she wasn't supposed to even be doing art.
Right.
So years later, fast forward, there's a protagonist, present day, and she does research because she's bringing a suit about getting reparations. So she needs, her law firm says that she needs to find a person to be the face of, slavery. So she has to find a direct descendant from a slave, and she has to use that person as the front man of the lawsuit to get reparations. So she does all the research, she does work, and she finds this guy, and she also uncovers the secret that this big foundation where the woman used to have her plantation, and it's huge, and it's like a lot of philanthropy. It's like a foundation where they get grants, and it's huge. But she finds out that the woman wasn't the real artist, that it was the house girl. So she authenticates that it was the house girl who actually did the artwork, and she's the true
But
artist.
see, that sounds like, again, that writer did the work, and like, there are two kinds of people who, there's you who read that book, looked at it, was shocked that the writer's right, but was cool with that. But some people are just like, no, I see her face, you can't tell that story. And that's where I ready to fight people in the streets, because if it works, it works. And I had years and years ago, my first short story collection, I did all these different first-person points of view, and one of them was this kind of white, tattooed skate punk kid. And when it was like in its like nascent state, it was workshopped, and there was this white guy, he was like, I can't wait to meet this Dana Johnson, his story was so cool. He was like, and I was like, it was so cool, because I was like, it was like one of my earlier workshops, and he was so into this story. And then when it was workshopped, it was revealed that I, Dana Johnson, who looks like this, wrote that story, and he took it apart. And it was such a lesson. It was just like, Some people think that you can't tell a story just because of what, and he went from saying, I really love this story, to you didn't get it right. What are you gonna do? You can't do anything about that. And so I wrote my story, and it's in the Breaking Woman Down, first short story collection. But that was me too, saying, I just feel like writing a story that's not a Black woman story. So I was writing, there's like a story, like Iranian sisters, I'm all over the place in that collection, and it's all first person. So,
Was it hard to do? And first person?
I mean, it probably would be harder now, because now I'm so like wary of like, but then I was just kind of having fun and doing my thing, and and no one called me out about messing things up, and it's just what, again, like, I feel like very old-fashioned these days, because now there would be someone who says you cannot do that.
Why are we in that era?
I mean, there's good reasons for it.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I just, my knee-jerk reaction, just as a writer, is to say, well, even as just a person, is that all of our identities are so complex and multiple. And I think one of the things that comes up as a writer and as a reader, but just as a human walking around, is like, I am not solely defined by the color of my skin.
Exactly.
That's not my only experience.
Exactly.
So when people say write what you know or write your story, well, which one?
Yeah.
Right? Like the one where I'm a man of color, or the one where, you know, there's probably some part of you, I think, that totally gets tattooed,
Right,
skateboarding. What cares if he's a white boy? You know, like, what's the difference? You know?
Exactly.
I mean, I get why people say that, but also as an artist or a writer, I really kind of don't believe in it. Or even as, honestly, as a human, I think that we're so composed of multiple selves. You know, I mean.
I love that. That's, composed of multiple selves.
We really
I
are.
totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, multiple.
And not strictly defined by the classics, our race, our gender, our sexual preference, you know, there's so much more than that.
Yeah.
Those census forms are just bullshit. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I get it, that defines part of our experience, and it's not swipe under the rug, but when we get beyond that, and particularly when we're writing fiction, there's more interesting things than those limited categories.
You know, the challenge for me was, I came of age in the era of busing in Berkeley and Oakland, and I was usually the only white kid, and my role models were the Black Panther principals. My friend, you know, I was a minority, and this is the world that, you know, that my first writer was Maya Angelou, whom I met and said, okay, I want to be that thing. So I have this really confused antenna about that and what I can write about in this era. So I actually really am appreciating.
There's a really fun section in Lola, California, actually, where one of the Lolas is learning like the handshake, the Black Panther handshake. And it's just a really great.
It's auto-fiction.
There was a question.
Oh, please.
What you were saying was interesting about the fun and how as the career progresses, the fun can be lost.
Yeah.
And that is a big danger. And how do we keep the fun going despite everything, and how one keeps the freshness? And sometimes it's not easy. And it's like, I can't hear the vibes from the surrounding, because if I do, I might not have the fun that I originally had.
Absolutely.
The fun of art making in this moment, when everything feels so dire.
Exactly what she was saying, how she might not have written those stories now, and how horrible that is, that the profession would be lost.
Yeah, there's something about, and I don't know what you guys feel about this, but something, you know, sometimes this sort of like professionalism of being a writer is like, it can really get in the way. And so when I was like 25 or whatever, and I was just kind of like really wanting to just write stories and think about the different ways that I could talk about being human. I wasn't thinking about, you know, like, who's telling me that I can't, what's the market for this, what's my audience going to be. I wasn't thinking about any of that, and I try not to think about that now, but, and then there's also the craft of writing, like the idea of like, are you literary enough? Are you serious enough? Or, like, all of these things can get in the way, and they weren't at all when I was that young, but now I try to like, just try and back away from that stuff, but it's there, it's just there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this question, a lot of questioning goes off of like that whole exchange. Like this might be maybe thinking more like what your students, how your students are grappling with like writing, you know, serious literature and like how the craft has changed just with like the stakes of like social media and just the pace of how we communicate and everything.
Yeah.
So like, you know, it's so complex, and then if you could think of like, on the upside, there's so many more, if you're writing like social fiction, right? Political fiction, what have you have so many more sources to draw from, right? But at the same time, you can just imagine like any sort of like utterance you kind of pronounce can just get lost or seem inauthentic or isn't up to date enough. So I'm just wondering like any sort of conversations or takeaways you've had, you know, regarding just the state of writing fiction given the reality of how we communicate today.
Yeah, I would say, I would go back to the ancient technology thing. Like, the faster the culture gets, the more, it's the opposite of what you would think. It's not that the novel becomes more in jeopardy. I think the novel becomes actually a much more precious thing. And actually, the faster the culture gets and the more it gets fragmented, the more the immersion, the deep immersion that happens when you read a novel, the more valuable that experience becomes. Right? So I'm not worried at all about the fate of the novel in that sense. Yeah, I also think that I don't know, I'm wary of saying, and you didn't say this, but I am wary of saying that social media has taken over our brains and the only experience in the internet age is one of fragmentation. Like there are also strange solidarities that happen on the internet or happen because of social media. There's just a lot of characteristics of the internet. Recycled content, you know, clickbait is a huge part of the internet. Like, I'd like to see that reflected in some fiction. You know, like, this recursive nature, like, the way you can fall down a rabbit hole. I mean, there's just a million ways to talk about the experience of how we're experiencing social media and communicating with each other now that doesn't have to be just fragmented and alienated, although it is that too, right?
But maybe a way to synthesize your seemingly different viewpoints is sort of like, remember that moment in art history when Duchamp said, okay, I'm going to put a frame around something, I'm going to call it art.
Yeah.
And in a way your question is saying, well, you know, geez, these things are getting exhausted by the social discourse. Where is the ornament, where's the vitality and the novelty that makes us pay attention, as in good art? So maybe there's some way to say, you know, we can put a frame around the solidarity, which, you know, your work does, you know.
But the other side of this too is when the short story collection, my short story collection came out in August, and so everyone was telling me, okay, you should start blogging, you need to get on Twitter, and I literally was like,
I saw that post of yours.
So someone helped me set up Twitter, because I'm an olds, and I couldn't figure out, like it's a pound sign, and I don't understand. I sent one tweet, and I just was like, I can't. I simply can't, and I'm not writing a blog, and I'm not running around like that. I just can't do it, but I still feel like I need to and I should, and that's a failure in a way as a writer. But it's like, but that's not being a writer, and yet it's part of the gig these days. So I'm always just like struggling with that stuff because I don't want to do it.
No, me neither.
But the good thing in that refusal, it's like you're having the song of myself. You're having the song of self. No. I think it's great because I think we go to the internet to say, do I exist? Do you think I exist? Do you think I exist? You know, it's like this real, the insecurity at the heart of the American psyche, you know, that it's going to like reaffirm our, you know, unmothered or unfathered or, you know, that makes us elect this infantilizing president, or some of us, you know. But it's like that hunger to be parented, or to have community. So, you know, good for you. Sing the song of self and say, I am going to be in that Woodmanic state of bliss.
Right, but then
You know?
of course it's like, well, if I tweeted, like, You know, one of the brilliant things about Roxane Gay is that, like, she is everywhere and it's amazing. And that has been part of her career, is like, she talks about everything. It's like she's a writer, but she's a cultural crit. Like, she does all of that, and that's part of the thing. And I mean, if that, I can't. Like,
But
I
yet
admire
it's-
her so much, but I'm like,
Some people have a mind for it, but like, I don't get it, how she can do pop culture and like deep cultural analysis. Like, she can absorb it all.
yeah.
Like,
it's
me, I
amazing.
read the internet all day and it's like, forget writing.
Exactly.
It's like, for some other people, for Roxane Gay, it seems like it stimulates. her mind,
Yeah,
right?
it's incredible.
Yeah, it's great.
On that note,
Oh.
we'll close up. Okay, well, thank you all for being, thank you to our great host, Noreen. And
Thank you everyone for coming out.
Yes.
Yeah.